You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this, like, really comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, sure. It feels almost like engineering.
Right, exactly. Like you fall, your arm swells up, you go to the hospital, and they take that x-ray, and it produces this stark, high contrast image, right? There is a jagged white line across the bone.
Yeah, and the pathology is totally contained within a defined boundary. The evidence is universally agreed upon. It's either broken or not broken.
Exactly. The doctor points at it with a pen, and there's a zero debate. But the moment you step outside the clinic and into the world of
Oh,
sociology,
yeah. That's a whole different game.
it really is into the, complex, sprawling mechanics of how entire societies or massive corporate structures function, or I guess more accurately, how they fail.
Right.
That x-ray machine just shatters. We find ourselves operating in a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Well, because when a macro system begins to fail, the symptoms, they don't present themselves as a clean fracture on an illuminated screen.
No, they definitely don't.
They present as friction. They present as these endless cyclical arguments over what even constitutes a valid metric of failure in the first place.
Which brings us to the razor-sharp sociological observation that serves as our entry point for today's deep dive. I want you, the listener, to picture a highly specific scenario.
Oh, wait.
Imagine you have developed a strictly rational, structurally sound argument. Let's say you're like a mid-level analyst at a major firm or an economist advising a local government.
Sure.
You have the historical data, you have the structural analysis, you have a mathematically verifiable solution to a glaring systemic problem that is just slowly bleeding the organization dry.
You've done the math.
You've done the math, you walk into the boardroom, and you present your findings.
And, I mean, assuming you are operating in a functional environment, you would expect a rational counter-argument, right?
Right.
If they disagree, they should present opposing data or like a different interpretation of the economic models.
But that isn't what happens. Instead, you run headfirst into one of the most effective, sophisticated, and honestly insidious defense mechanisms ever designed to neutralize a rational argument.
It's brutal.
It is. The opposing side, usually the executive leadership, they don't ask you for more data. They don't point out a flaw in your spreadsheet. Instead, they subtly, almost imperceptibly, raise the evidentiary bar to a supernatural level.
Yeah, they demand a type of validation that is fundamentally physically impossible to produce.
It's the equivalent of them looking at your supply chain analysis and saying, this all looks very nice on paper, but until an actual literal angel descends from the heavens,
Right.
stands in the middle of this boardroom, and formally endorses your new logistics policy with a 100% guarantee of zero friction for the next century, we simply cannot take the risk.
And what is genuinely fascinating about this tactic is how it disguises itself as intellectual rigor.
Oh, that's the trick, isn't it?
Exactly. On the surface, to a casual observer, the leadership sounds like they're exercising this profound, cautious skepticism.
Right, they sound responsible.
They sound like they are simply setting high standards for institutional change. But in reality, it's a highly engineered stalling mechanism.
It's a trap.
It is. It's a socio-political strategy for maintaining the status quo by ensuring that the criteria for implementing change can never actually be met.
So we are dissecting the anatomy of that exact stalling tactic today. And our source material for this analysis comes from a rather unexpected place.
A very unexpected place for this kind of structural breakdown.
Yeah. We are diving into excerpts from a really fascinating lecture series that analyzes a foundational text of civilizational survival. Specifically, we're looking at a brilliant structural analysis of verses 19 through 29 of the 25th chapter of the Quran, a chapter known as Al-Furqan.
Which translates to the criterion or the standard of discrimination.
Right. And to establish the parameters of our analysis right out of the gate for you, the listener, we are entirely putting aside any religious sentimentality today.
Completely. The framework we're using does not view this text through a mystical or theological lens at all.
No, we are reading this exclusively as master sociologists and systems engineers.
Precisely. The excerpts we are analyzing, they treat this specific passage as a literal functional manual on how complex societies collapse under the weight of unproven assertions.
And conversely, how they might survive if they adopt a rigorous, rational architecture.
Exactly.
So the phenomenon we are unpacking, this demand for impossible proof, it's documented with just astonishing precision in verse 21 of Al-Furqan.
It's laid out right there.
The text states, those who do not hope to meet with us say, Why were no angels sent to us? Why don't we see our Lord?
And the diagnostic brilliance of this passage, it doesn't lie in simply pointing out that demanding angels is absurd, right?
Right, obviously demanding an angel is absurd.
The brilliance lies in its laser-focused identification of exactly who is deploying this tactic.
The demographic.
The demographic. The text specifies those who do not hope to meet with us.
And this is where the linguistic analysis in our source material completely shifts the paradigm. The original Arabic phrase used here is la yarjuna liqwana.
Right.
Now, conventionally, historically, this has always been read as a description of spiritual apathy. People assume it means a group of individuals who lack spiritual desire, who don't want a mystical vision of the afterlife.
But when you apply a sociological lens to the linguistic root, the entire meaning transforms into a commentary on systemic accountability.
Oh, it's fascinating.
It really is. The root word liqua fundamentally means a meeting, an encounter, or a functional engagement.
It's an appointment, a performance review, a structural audit.
Yes. Therefore, La Yarjuna Liqwana describes a highly specific demographic. Those who do not hope, or more accurately, those who do not expect to encounter the rational order.
Wow.
It identifies a subset of people within a system who do not want to be measured against a functional, objective system of cause and effect.
So the question immediately becomes, why would anyone actively fear the rational order? Why would an individual or a group just shrink away from objective measurement?
Well, the answer the framework provides is chillingly recognizable.
Because they are insulated.
Exactly. Because they are the vested interests.
Yeah.
They are the individuals whose current social, economic, or political position is entirely dependent on the system remaining dysfunctional.
They are the elite class within a very specific, unbalanced architecture, and they possess this deep, unspoken awareness that their elevated status is not tied to their actual utility or function.
They know it.
They know that if a purely rational order were applied, if their output was objectively measured against the resources they consume, they would lose their standing.
Instantly.
Wait, I need to process that because it challenges how we typically view corporate or political resistance.
Okay, let's unpack it.
I mean, if someone pitches a radical plan to fix my company isn't demanding flawless proof, just good business sense, why is skepticism suddenly the villain here?
It comes down to the difference between proportional skepticism and artificial friction.
Proportional versus artificial.
Okay.
Right.
Healthy, functional skepticism demands evidence that is proportional to the claim, and more importantly, it's possible to obtain within the laws of physics and economics.
Makes sense. Like if an engineer claims they've designed a more efficient engine.
Healthy skepticism says, show me the prototype running on a dynamometer. Show me the thermal efficiency data.
Right.
But artificial friction, the stalling tactic we're talking about, says, I will only approve this engine if you can mathematically prove it will never require maintenance for 1,000 years.
So one seeks to verify the function, while the other seeks to prevent the transition entirely.
Precisely. They aren't asking for evidence, they are building a moat.
Okay, let's anchor this in a massive historical case study just to see how this La Yarjuna Liqana operates in the real world. Think back to the lead-up to the 2008 global financial crisis.
Oh, the perfect example.
Right, you had this sprawling, highly lucrative system built on subprime, mortgage-backed securities. Now, within these massive financial institutions, you had risk analysts, quants, and mid-level economists looking at the raw data.
They were the rational reformers in this scenario.
Exactly. They saw the default rates rising. They saw the mathematical reality that the system was doomed.
And they took that data to the executive leadership. They presented the rational argument for immediate structural reform.
And what did the insulated elite, the executives pulling down multi-million-dollar bonuses based on the sheer volume of these toxic loans, what did they do?
They didn't dismantle the quant's math.
Because the math was objectively correct. Instead, they deployed the supernatural proof requirement. They demanded predictive certainty that was entirely impossible.
They essentially said, unless you can prove to us with absolute undeniable clairvoyance that the entire global housing market will collapse on exactly Tuesday at 3:00 p.m., we are not going to stop writing these highly profitable loans.
That is the perfect modern manifestation of verse 21. Those executives were La Yarjuna Liqwana. They did not want to encounter the rational order where their bonuses were actually tied to long-term economic health.
No, their social and financial insulation depended entirely on delaying that encounter for as long as possible. So they demanded the modern equivalent of an angel.
Because they intuitively understood that no rational argument, no matter how brilliantly evidenced or meticulously researched, can threaten their elite status as long as the broader institutional culture accepts this supernatural proof requirement as a valid standard.
They build a moat of impossible standards around their own dysfunction.
Which brings us to a really critical inflection point in the analysis. If this impossible demand is the ultimate weapon of the insulated elite, we have to examine the collateral damage.
What actually happens to the architecture of a society or an organization when this stalling tactic successfully holds off reality?
Right. And the source material tackles this by dissecting another incredibly precise Arabic term, alam. Now, in almost any standard English translation of this text, you'll see this word rendered as wrongdoer, sinner, or oppressor.
And those translations immediately drag the concept into a highly subjective moralistic territory.
Yeah, it sounds like a generic ethical failing, like someone who just does bad things.
But the sociological framework we're using strips away the moralizing and looks at the structural engineering definition of the root word ulum.
Zulm means displacing things from their proper functional place.
It is the act of unbalancing an equation. It is architectural distortion.
So it's not just being mean.
No. To use a physical analogy,
Mm.
if you are constructing a high-rise building and you take a massive load-bearing titanium pillar,
Okay.
and instead of placing it where it needs to support the structure, you move it into the center of a decorative foyer just because it looks imposing.
You have committed an architectural zulm.
Exactly. The pillar is out of its functional place. The foyer is blocked, and the ceiling elsewhere is now prone to collapse.
So if we translate that physical engineering concept into societal engineering, when a culture elevates profoundly incompetent or purely extractive individuals to positions of divine-like authority simply because of their lineage, their wealth, or their ability to manipulate media, that is a massive structural zulm.
They have placed a non-load-bearing entity in a load-bearing position.
And the inverse is equally destructive.
Right, absolutely. When a society takes human beings who inherently possess complex cognitive capabilities, dignity, and immense developmental potential and pushes them down into the foundation to be used as mere commodities.
Like disposable labor or raw data points to be exploited.
Yes, that is also Zulm.
You're taking the dynamic engines of your society and burying them in the concrete.
Exactly. Both actions are structural distortions. They are displacing vital elements of the socioeconomic system from their proper functional locations.
So we have this really vivid picture of a deeply distorted, unbalanced architecture. The elite are artificially elevated, insulated from consequence, and the masses are treated as disposable commodities.
And into this highly pressurized environment steps the reformer.
Right. The individual or group trying to apply the rational order. The text notes a fascinating reaction from the elite in verse 20. When faced with this rational reformer, the elite don't attack the reform itself.
They attack the reformer's ordinary humanity.
They complain incredulously that the reformer eats food and walks in the markets.
This reaction exposes the profound insecurity of the vested interests. I mean, why is a person walking through a market needing normal food such an existential threat to them?
Because the elite demand that anyone claiming legitimate authority must be superhuman.
Right. Because if the reformer is just an ordinary human being, someone who gets stuck in traffic, buys groceries, has a completely normal biological existence.
And this ordinary person is successfully applying rational, objective principles to fix the society.
It completely destroys the elite's entire mythology of superiority.
Oh, totally. Because it implies that the elite, who have spent generations cultivating this aura of untouchable, almost magical superiority, are absolute frauds.
If a functional understanding of societal mechanics does not require royal blood, massive wealth, or supernatural endorsement, then the elite's monopoly on power is entirely illegitimate.
An ordinary human applying a rational standard is a systemic threat to an artificially inflated status.
Therefore, the elite must insist that true authority possesses magical qualities, precisely because their own authority relies on illusions.
Okay, I am tracking with this entirely, but I have a major psychological hurdle here.
What's that?
Well, I look around at history from the collapse of the Bronze Age empires to the fall of Rome, right up to modern political and corporate dynasties. If the system is so clearly distorted, if the architecture is visibly cracking under the weight of this zulm, why do the masses go along with it?
It's the million-dollar question.
Right. Why do the people being treated as disposable commodities buy into this demand for supernatural proof? Why don't they just rally behind the rational data?
The framework provides a deeply uncomfortable answer to that, rooted in the psychology of unproven assertions. The masses submit to a subjective, fabricated standard of authority because they have been conditioned to mistake the performance of authority for the function of authority.
They confuse the gold plating for the engine block.
Precisely. The vested interests pour massive resources into branding the reformer as just an ordinary guy.
They point to the reformer and say to the public, look at him, he shops where you shop. He doesn't have a massive PR team. He doesn't have a private jet.
He certainly doesn't have an escort of angels. How could someone so painfully ordinary possibly know how to fix the macroeconomic structure?
And we as a society are heavily conditioned to ignore ordinary people. We assume that if someone has the answer, they would already be sitting on a throne of some kind.
Exactly. So the masses reject the rational mathematical evidence because the delivery mechanism doesn't have a halo.
And they accept the unproven assertion of the elite simply because the elite have the theatrical staging of power.
It is a devastating cycle of cognitive bias engineered by the people at the top. And this is where the sociological analysis turns into a study of structural distortions cannot exist indefinitely.
They just can't.
A building with displaced load-bearing pillars can only defy gravity for so long. Eventually, the accumulated stress overcomes the material strength, and the system begins to tear itself apart.
Which brings us to the inevitable consequence, detailed in verses 27 and 28. The text describes this moment with an incredibly visceral image. The Arabic phrase is Yawma ya'alalimu ala yadayhi, the day the wrongdoer bites his hands.
And once again, the source material insists we strip away the traditional religious iconography here. This is not a scene of theatrical wailing regret at the gates of some mystical afterlife.
This hand-biting is a highly specific, excruciating cognitive experience that happens in the physical world.
It is the psychological rupture that occurs at the exact moment when the connection between a past irrational choice and its present devastating consequence becomes mathematically undeniable.
Let's put a microscope on that moment, because it's huge. The alim, the architect of the structural distortion, or the executive who demanded the impossible proof to stall the reform, or even the everyday citizen who supported the elite out of a desire for proximity to power.
They suddenly hit the wall.
The societal architecture they warped finally gives way, and it collapses directly onto them.
And verse 27 explicitly links this agonizing regret not to a lack of piety, but to a rejection of rational strategy. The person biting their hand says, I wish I had taken the path alongside the reformer, ma rasuli sabila.
That is such a crucial distinction. They don't cry out, I wish I had prayed more often, or I wish I'd performed more rituals.
No, they explicitly state, I wish I had aligned myself with the functional systemic reform.
They realize, entirely too late, that the demand for supernatural proof was a suicidal delaying tactic.
But the text forces us to ask a terrifying question. Why did they ignore the rational reform when the window for change was still open?
If the data showed the building was going to collapse, why did they actively choose to stay inside?
The source introduces the concept of deek in verse 29 to answer this.
Okay, unpack deek.
The framework defines deek as the active memory, the constant reminder of rational operating principles. It is the data set. It is the blueprint of reality.
So the individual in question actually had access to this rational tool.
Yes. They possessed the Furqan, the criterion for making functional objective decisions. The internal audit was on their desk. The environmental impact report was in their inbox.
But they actively, consciously chose to lead themselves away from it.
They did.
Why? I mean, if the math is clear, why reject it?
Social proximity.
Social proximity.
This is perhaps the most universally recognizable, chilling part of the entire analysis. Verse 28 specifically cites bad peer relationships as the mechanism of failure.
Right, the handbiter laments, I wish I'd not taken so-and-so as a friend.
So-and-so as a friend. It is profoundly mundane.
It really is.
Because human systems operate on mundane social mechanics. Communities and corporate cultures do not suppress rational operating principles solely through brute force or tyrannical laws.
No, they suppress the truth through the overwhelming, unbearable social cost of applying it.
Exactly. The tyranny of unproven assertions is maintained by the primal fear of being ostracized by your peer group.
Let's ground this in a real-world scenario to show how powerful this social mechanism is. Think of a whistleblower in a deeply insular, corrupt industry. Let's look at, say, the pharmaceutical industry during the early days of a drug crisis, or a major tech company manipulating user data.
A classic scenario.
The whistleblower has the DIC. They have the internal emails, the active memory of how basic medical ethics or privacy laws are supposed to work. The objective math is completely on their side.
But the social cost of standing up and going against their industry friends, their colleagues, their mentors who brought them into the firm, that cost is astronomical.
Right. If they apply the Furqan, if they discriminate between the truth and the profitable lie and demand rational change, they know exactly what will happen.
They will be fired.
They will be blacklisted from the industry. They'll be quietly uninvited from the country club dinners, excluded from the Slack channels, and completely alienated from the social network that provides their identity.
So what does the human brain do in that highly pressurized environment?
It actively chooses cognitive dissonance.
Yes, the individual sides with so-and-so the friend,
Yeah.
rather than the rational data, because the immediate visceral pain of social death outweighs the abstract future consequence of systemic failure.
They trade structural reality for social comfort, right up until the consequence is no longer abstract.
Right up until the federal indictments drop, the company goes bankrupt, and their career is destroyed anyway.
That is the moment of hand-biting. The artificial social pressure instantly evaporates, the friends who convince them to ignore the data just abandon them, and the mathematics of their choices are the only things left in the room.
That transition from social illusion to mathematical reality brings us to the bedrock principle of this entire sociological framework. It is the most unyielding law of civilizational mechanics discussed in our source material.
The text refers to it as the law of requital. In Urdu philosophical literature, it's often referred to as mukafat-e-amal.
This concept is the engine under the hood of the entire universe, according to this analysis. In verse 19, the text summarizes the elite's victory over the reformer. Fakad kadabukum bima takuluna. They have denied what you say.
So the vested interests ran their PR campaign, they demanded their supernatural proof, they applied their social pressure, and they won the narrative battle. The rational argument was successfully denied.
But then the text drops the hammer. Because denial of the rational order does not suspend the rational order.
That is the core axiom of the law of requital. It operates exactly like a blind, highly calibrated machine. The law of cause and effect applied to human action and social systems is completely unambiguous.
It doesn't read the press releases.
It doesn't care about the corporate mission statement.
And crucially, it does not wait for a community to acknowledge its presence before it begins processing consequences.
Like, if a society builds a massive suspension bridge using substandard, corruptly sourced steel, gravity does not wait for the city council to hold a press conference admitting they took a bribe before it starts pulling the bridge down.
Exactly. The causal chain is locked and active the exact millisecond. The faulty steel is riveted into place. The consequence is already gestating within the action.
The source material highlights a fascinating linguistic clue in the text that demonstrates just how absolute this law is. When we go back to verse 27, where the architect of the distortion is biting his hand, the English translation usually says, "I wish I had taken the path."
But the Arabic word used for I wish is laita.
And the linguistic breakdown shows that laita has a very specific, devastating connotation in classical Arabic.
It does. It is not a casual wish. If you want a cup of coffee, you don't use laita, because getting a cup of coffee is within the realm of possibility.
Right.
A laita is reserved to express a desperate wish for something entirely, fundamentally impossible. It is a wish to undo something that the laws of physics and time dictate can never be undone.
So when the structural displacement collapses and the wrongdoer bites his hand and utters laita, it is not a lessons learned seminar. It is not an opportunity to pivot or rebrand.
No. Uttering laita is the definitive statement of the law of requital experience from the inside. It is the terrifying realization that the causal chain has already processed the inputs and locked into its final, inescapable output.
The time for the Furqan, the time for rational discrimination and course correction has permanently expired. All that remains is the physics of the consequence.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a massive philosophical pushback.
Go for it.
Because the framework you are laying out sounds incredibly deterministic. It sounds cold. What about human subjectivity? What about good intentions?
Look at history. How many political leaders, corporate executives, or even revolutionary figures displaced the architecture of their societies because they genuinely, passionately believed they were doing good?
Maybe.
What if the executive suppressing the data truly believed he was protecting thousands of jobs by keeping the company afloat just one more quarter? What if the political leader demanding impossible proof from reformers truly believes she is protecting the culture from dangerous instability? Doesn't sincerity count for something in the structural equation?
The source material addresses this exact human tendency head-on, and it is perhaps the most confrontational, uncompromising part of the entire analysis.
Okay.
The framework makes a stark assertion. Sincerity is not a proof for sanity.
Sincerity is not a proof for sanity. Let's sit with that for a second, because that phrase completely dismantles the way we judge modern politics and leadership. We obsess over whether a leader is authentic or sincere, as if that guarantees the policies will work.
It exposes the fatal flaw of human subjectivity. Think about the last 2,500 years of human history. From the ancient Greek philosophers through the Enlightenment right up to modern utilitarianism, human subjectivity has entirely failed to universally define what is good and what is evil.
We have massive libraries filled with contradictory ethics and absolutely no consensus.
Because my subjective definition of a good society might require your subjective definition of an evil sacrifice.
Right.
Therefore, if a complex social system attempts to operate purely on the fuel of subjective good intentions, it is flying blind into a mountain. Good intentions, if they displace the objective rational order, are mathematically useless.
The text uses an incredible metaphor in verse 23 to describe the ultimate structural weight of these misguided good intentions. It refers to them as haban manthura, scattered dust.
The imagery is perfectly precise. Scattered dust holds absolutely zero structural weight. It cannot support a load.
Yeah.
The text is saying that actions that ignore the rational order, no matter how passionately, authentically, or sincerely they were performed, register as zero in the objective balance of cause and effect.
To use a very grounded example, if you, sincerely, with all your heart, believe that watering a plastic houseplant will make it grow, and you water it with profound dedication and love every single morning for 10 straight years.
You are still just creating a puddle on your floor.
Exactly. Your massive sincerity did not alter the biological reality of the plastic.
And translating that back to civilizational mechanics. If a leadership class sincerely believes that endlessly extracting wealth from the lower classes to build monumental vanity projects will eventually bring universal prosperity, their profound sincerity does not negate the catastrophic economic collapse that will mathematically follow the exhaustion of their labor force.
The law of requital processes the physical action and the structural displacement. It does not process the emotion behind the action. So we have painted a rather grim picture here. Human subjectivity is flawed. Good intentions are scattered dust if they ignore reality. The elite demand impossible supernatural proof to maintain their insulation, and the masses enable it out of social fear.
It's a dark cycle.
It is. And this cycle leads to the Leda moment, the hand-biting collapse. So if this is the diagnostic reality of human history, how does a civilization ever actually move forward? How do we break the cycle and evolve without constantly hitting the wall?
Well, this is where the source material transitions from a diagnostic critique into a blueprint for architectural evolution. It introduces two highly sophisticated Arabic terms to map out how life, operating at both the biological and the civilizational level, is actually designed to function: mustakar and mustada.
I found this section of the analysis absolutely mind-blowing. It essentially shifts the entire conversation from sociology into systems biology and thermodynamics.
It is a profoundly dynamic worldview. The framework, referencing verse 6.98, views the entire phenomenon of life as an evolutionary process that began from a single unilateral cell. Life is not a static portrait. It is an engine of continuous development.
Okay.
And in this universe, progress occurs through stages. When a biological entity or a societal system reaches a specific stage of development, a point of functional consolidation, it has entered a mustakar.
A mustakar translates to a resting place or a stage of stability. But the absolute key to understanding this concept is that a mustakar is inherently temporary.
Yes. In a functional universe, a mustakar is never the final destination. It is a necessary phase of consolidation. Why does it consolidate? So that it can organize its resources and gather its strength to become a mustada, which translates to a repository, or a state of entrusted potential.
It gathers its strength specifically so it can hand the trust, the accumulated evolutionary progress, over to the next necessary stage. It is the mechanism of continuous upward momentum.
Now, let's apply these thermodynamic concepts to a society. When a civilization reaches a peak, let's say they've achieved unprecedented technological advancement, incredible economic wealth, or a long period of social peace, They have successfully entered a mustakar phase.
They have leveled up. They are resting on a plateau of success.
But how they handle that plateau determines their survival. Historically, what happens? The insulated elite, the ones benefiting most from the current architecture, become terrified of the next evolutionary step because it might threaten their specific placement.
So they attempt to freeze time. They declare that history is over. They attempt to turn a temporary, dynamic mustakar into a permanent, stagnant monument.
They refuse to become a mustada. They refuse to entrust their progress to the next generation or the next technological paradigm or the next necessary social reform.
And the universe as a system does not tolerate permanent stagnation. Entropy eventually consumes closed systems. If you refuse to be a mustada, the system will eventually break you to force the transition.
Let's use a very physical analogy to visualize this. Imagine a high-stakes Olympic relay race.
Okay.
You have a runner who has just received the baton. While they are sprinting their leg of the race at maximum speed, they are in their mustakar phase. They have the momentum, they have the power, the stadium is cheering for them. They are the absolute focal point of the event.
But their entire purpose, biologically, systemically, and within the strict rules of the race, is not to just keep running wildly on the track until their heart explodes.
Right. Their one and only functional purpose is to be a mustada, to reach the exchange zone, recognize that their stage is ending, and entrust the baton to the next runner.
Now, what does the insulated Layarjuna Likwana elite do in this relay race analogy? They receive the baton, they sprint for 100 meters, they fall in love with the sound of the crowd, and they decide, I am the greatest runner who has ever lived. I am never passing this baton. I am going to hold on to it forever.
And when the coach, acting as the rational reformer, runs alongside the track, holding up the stopwatch, shouting, "You are losing speed. You have to pass the baton or the entire team is disqualified." The runner deploys the stalling tactic. They demand supernatural proofs. They yell back, "I will only pass this baton if an angel descends and mathematically guarantees me that the next runner is capable of running faster than the speed of light."
It is the perfect absurd stalling tactic used to justify stopping the race. They demand impossible guarantees to avoid the inherent vulnerability of the transition. They fear the evolutionary change.
And by clenching their fists around the baton and refusing the mustada phase, they guarantee the catastrophic failure of the entire system.
Exactly.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the corporate death of a company like Blockbuster, right? Refusing to transition to digital streaming because they demanded impossible proof that it would replace physical rentals. They froze in their mustakar and died.
Yeah. So, this begs the ultimate question of the deep dive. If we manage to successfully pass the baton, if a society uses the Furqan to break the cycle of supernatural demands, rejects social pressure, and embraces the evolutionary transition, what are we actually building? What does the optimal stage of civilizational evolution look like? Who holds the authority when the rational order finally wins?
This brings us to the synthesis of the entire framework and the culmination of the source materials analysis. The text makes a stunning definitive declaration in verse 26 of chapter 25. True authority on that day will belong to Al-Rahman.
Now, we need to do a serious linguistic excavation of this word Rahman, because in standard theological English translations, this is almost always rendered as the most merciful or the compassionate.
And while those are pleasant words, they drag us right back into the realm of abstract emotion and sentimentality that we've been avoiding. And the sociological framework argues that treating Rahman merely as an emotional descriptor of a deity completely misses the profound architectural blueprint embedded in the word. The root of Rahman consists of the Arabic letters R, H, M. This is the exact same root used for the Arabic word for a mother's womb.
A mother's womb. Okay, let's completely unpack the biological and systemic reality of how a womb functions, because it is a masterpiece of engineering.
The womb is the ultimate optimal environment for organic development. It is a closed system of perfect support. It provides total comprehensive nourishment. It provides absolute physical protection from external shock.
It perfectly regulates temperature, it provides a constant flow of oxygen, and it actively filters out toxins.
It provides the exact, customized environmental parameters necessary for a single vulnerable cell to develop into a highly complex, unique human being with its own distinct individuality.
And the crucial architectural detail, the absolute kicker in the source's analysis, is that the womb provides this total developmental support without demanding compensation.
Exactly. The biological system of the mother does not invoice the fetus for calcium. She does not send a bill for the oxygen transfer.
The nourishment is structurally guaranteed as a fundamental, non-negotiable right of the developing entity simply because it exists within the system. It is a relationship of universal, non-extractive support.
So translate that biological engineering into civilizational mechanics. The ideal state, the ultimate evolutionary mustakar that human society should be sprinting toward, is not built on extraction.
It is not built on tyranny or debt peonage or squeezing the labor of the masses to build pyramids or artificially inflate corporate stock portfolios.
The ideal society operates like a womb. It is a rational, nourishing architecture.
It is a socioeconomic system that structurally, legally, and mathematically guarantees the basic well-being, nourishment, and developmental needs of every single individual. Not as a transaction, not as a reward for submissive behavior, but as a baseline function of the architecture.
Okay, the logical extension of that is massive, but I have to throw a major real-world pushback at you here, because I can hear the economists and the critics screaming right now.
Oh, for sure. Let's hear it.
If a state or a society provides absolutely everything like a mother, universal health care, unconditional basic income, guaranteed housing, free education, whatever the modern equivalents of that womb-like nourishment are, doesn't that inherently breed a weak, dependent society?
Right. Doesn't that completely destroy human drive, innovation, and resilience, like a welfare state on steroids?
It's the most vital question you can ask. And what is truly remarkable is that the framework completely anticipates this exact failure mode. The source material explicitly warns against what it diagnoses as the mother's child
The
syndrome.
mother's child syndrome.
Yes. The analysis actually branches out to cite Western philosophers like John Locke, and it points to historical cultural practices of obsessive motherland worship to illustrate the danger. If a society becomes overly dependent if it receives endless, unconditional maternal nourishment, without any corresponding structural expectation of growth, duty, and capability, it becomes deeply infantilized.
It lacks self-reliance. It lacks the friction necessary to build muscle.
It lacks what the source calls self-confidence. And historically, sociologically, societies suffering from the mother's child syndrome become soft, stagnant, and easily colonized by more aggressive external forces. They stayed in the womb too long and forgot how to walk.
But the text also warns against the exact opposite extreme, which is the system we currently live under in many parts of the world. Pure, cold, paternalistic authority.
The system of pure rules, pure extraction, and pure punishment. The source uses the literary analogy of Shylock demanding his pound of flesh, or the historical reality of Pharaoh extracting endless, brutal slave labor.
Under pure paternalistic tyranny, your individuality is crushed. You are not a developing human being with unique potential. You are just a tool, a cog, a battery powering the state.
You work exclusively out of a desperate fear of the whip, or the modern equivalent, the fear of starvation and homelessness.
So if pure maternal nourishment creates a weak, infantilized society, and pure paternalistic authority creates a crushed, enslaved society, what exactly is the system of Al-Rahman?
It is the perfect, meticulously calibrated synthesis of both. The system of Al-Rahman provides the unconditional systemic support the womb so that basic physical and economic survival is never in question. Fear of starvation is removed from the societal equation, but it pairs that baseline nourishment with a rigorous demand for rational growth and active duty.
It's the concept of responsibility, capital R, hyphen in the middle, responsibility.
Yes. In this optimal architecture, individuals do not work out of a primal fear of destitution, nor do they work as indentured servants, constantly trying to pay off the debt of their own existence to the elite. They work as a joyful, rational response to a system that structurally guarantees their well-being.
The source introduces a brilliant Arabic word here, labbaik. It roughly translates to, here I am at your service. But it's not a subservient phrase. It is an enthusiastic, voluntary response.
The psychology changes entirely. If I know objectively that the system has my back unconditionally, that my health care, my family's food, my basic dignity, my natural rational response is not to sit on the couch forever.
My response is to contribute my maximum, unique potential back into the system. I don't hoard my energy and my ideas out of a fear of scarcity. I expend them aggressively out of a foundation of absolute security.
That synthesis is the ultimate reformer's path. Choosing to align with Rasuli Sabil is not a call to adopt a new religion or practice new mystical rituals. It is a highly precise sociological call to build a very specific type of socioeconomic engine.
An engine based on universal, non-extractive nourishment paired with rational duty, rather than an engine based on extraction maintained by unproven mythological authority.
Exactly.
Man, this has been an absolutely massive paradigm-shifting journey today. Let's map out the complete causal chain we've explored, step by step, so we can see the whole architecture.
Good idea.
We start with a failing, unbalanced system suffering from structural Zulm. The load-bearing pillars are in the wrong place. The vested interests, insulated from the pain of this dysfunction, realize they are under threat from the data brought by rational reformers.
Right. And to protect their unearned status, they refuse to engage with the math. Instead, they deploy the ultimate stalling tactic. They demand impossible supernatural proofs. Show us the angels.
And they successfully maintain this impossible demand by leveraging intense, localized social pressure. They make it socially and professionally ruinous for anyone to apply the Furqan, the tool of rational, objective discrimination.
The broader community accepts the impossible standard and ignores the data out of a primal desire to conform and maintain their peer networks.
But the universe, as a thermodynamic and sociological system, does not care about PR campaigns, executive bonuses, or country club memberships. The law of requital, the blind grinding machine of cause and effect, processes the structural distortion.
It processes the faulty steel in the bridge. And eventually, inevitably, the system fractures and collapses.
This leads to the agonizing hand-biting phase, the brutal cognitive realization that the rational path was ignored for the sake of temporary social comfort, the impossible, desperate wish, Lida, that the causal chain could somehow be unspooled.
And the framework insists that the only way to break this repeatable destructive cycle of history is to embrace the vulnerability of the evolutionary process, to recognize that every stage of stability, every corporate or societal peak is just a mustakar, a temporary resting place, whose only true function is to consolidate resources and safely hand the baton over to the next stage, the mustada.
And the ultimate evolutionary finish line we are running toward. Building the architecture of Al-Rahman, dismantling the systems of extraction and tyranny, and painstakingly designing a socio-economic engine that acts like a womb, providing unconditional baseline nourishment while demanding the joyful, rational responsibility of labak.
It is a profound, mathematically rigorous, and incredibly demanding vision for civilizational survival. It requires a complete abandonment of the comfort found in unproven assertions and a willingness to face the rational order of the Liquore head-on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into civilizational mechanics, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly practical thought to mull over. We have spent the last hour discussing ancient linguistic roots, the collapse of empires, and the thermodynamics of society. But this exact dynamic is playing out right now in miniature all around you.
It really is.
Look closely at the institutions you interact with every single day. Look at your corporate leadership, your local city council, or the macro-political structures you participate in. Look for the friction. Where are the leaders right now who are deploying the stalling tactic? Who is demanding supernatural proof? Who is demanding absolutely impossible, risk-free, 100-year guarantees just to avoid making a rational, mathematically obvious, and urgently necessary change?
Yeah, and more importantly, when you identify them, what is the social cost you are actively choosing to pay to pretend their impossible demands are reasonable?
Remember that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning of the show? The fracture in the bone is there. The structural failure is active. It is there whether you demand an angel to descend and point at it or not. The only real question left is how long you are willing to let the system warp before you decide to apply the Furqan and set the bone.